Okay, so let's, we talked last week about a few different ways to think about the project. First week I showed you some images just of the geography of Apollo and how it maps politically and industrially onto the nation. Last week we talked about chronology. And you know, it's one thing we forgot on the chronology actually was the X-15 program, which was also going almost exactly in parallel with the Apollo and ended right about when Apollo ended. And there's a few, something that was occurring to me why that was relevant coming in early on. Well, one of them is that Neil Armstrong is sort of plucked out of that program. And today I gave you these three readings by Walter Vincenti and Roger Launius and Phil Scranton about yet further ways to look at the project. So let's talk a little bit about Vincenti. And who is Walter Vincenti? Let's start there. Anybody know?
Can you tell us the names of the titles of the papers? I didn't write down in my head what the authors' names were versus the...
Sure.
I didn't realize that would be a very important...
Okay, well, so that's a good thing to bring up because I mentioned the first week, whenever you read any piece of history, and it's true really of any document you read, you want to know who's writing this, right? And sometimes it tells you on the back of the book if you have the book. Sometimes there's a little bio in the book. Sometimes you got to go to Wikipedia or anywhere else. That it's pretty easy to look up these days. Because it matters, is this person, you know, a journalist, a professor, an astronaut, whatever, heavily shapes their point of view. So you always want to look and ask that. So the Engineering as Knowledge, was that the title of it? Is the Walter Vincenti chapter. It's in the syllabus. Yeah, chapter 1 from What Engineers Know and How They Know It. Anybody look who Walter Vincenti is? Just judging by the reading, what would you say about him? He's a research engineer. He actually headed the Aero-Astro program at Stanford, or I think it was only the Aero program when he headed it. During much of the Cold War, he was a very prominent high-speed aerodynamicist, and then became a historian sort of late in his career when he wrote this book. So his perspective is very much, what do we think about, how do we think about engineering historically, but mostly the book is sort of philosophically from the point of view of an engineer. What is he writing against? Another question you always want to ask. Most people, especially when you read academic writing and particularly academic history, most people start out saying, you know, so-and-so's view of this is not the right view and I'm going to give you my view. So, and that's always a good question. So what are they writing against?
I think he's writing against to kind of dispel this idea that engineering is just applied science and rehashing.
Good. So, well, applied science is not necessarily rehashing, but he's very much trying to get out of the mode of engineers look at what science is. And just apply it, right? And there's any number of stories that, you know, the famous one in history of technology is over the World's Fair in 1939. It said, "Science discovers, engineering applies, man conforms." But there is this notion that what engineering is taking science and just applying it to the real world. And another famous phrase from the patent law is reduction to practice, right? We know how it works. Now you guys just go reduce it to practice. What's wrong with that idea?
That engineering is not applied science, or that it is?
That it is.
It glosses over the entire art of translating some scientific knowledge into something that's actually useful. What's common practice, what causes something to be common practice for implementation. How do you combine all of these details together to make a functional product?
Okay, good, very good. What else? Other ways to put that?
Takes away any creativity or innovation
Oh,
engineers.
Okay, it doesn't leave much room for creativity and innovation. Leaves out a lot of the practical details.
Yeah, and like Liberty said, like that quote that he took from the aeronautical engineer, and he was talking about how the same idea is like it's creative art, like you build airplanes despite science, despite everything telling you not to. And it's just like a really
Yeah.
cool way of saying like it's not just taking science, like, there's a lot more involved in it. It's really problem solving.
Right, very good. In fact, I think there's just as much of a case to be made that science is applied engineering. Maybe not applied, but and aerodynamics is not a bad example of the engineers discovered that it worked first, and later scientists figured out why wings generate lift. Decades later, in some cases. Another classic example of that is steam engines, where physicists thought they understood thermodynamics. Then engineers started making steam engines. They didn't always work the way that science predicted them to work. Still, people were able to innovate and make them better and better and better. And then they ended up with machines that nobody understood how they worked. Going and actually creating a science of thermodynamics was valuable, certainly helped then feed back and improve steam engines, but was not necessary in order to invent or make or improve quite large, quite sophisticated steam engines. And there's any number of examples of that. Aerodynamics is actually a very good one. In fact, one of the chapters in his book is about what's called the Davis wing, which is the wing that was on the B-24, which was sort of invented by this guy who had not a whole lot of background in engineering. He sort of proved that it seemed to work well. And they built, I forget how many B-24s they built. It was in the order of 20,000 of them during the Second World War, maybe even more. And they flew fine. They dropped bombs on Germany and other places. And later it turned out the wing really was no better than other equivalents that were lighter and easier to build. But somehow it was plausible, and he's interested in why. So thinking about engineering as applied science glosses over all these things. And the way that Vincenti phrases what he's interested in is all these different kinds of knowledge that comprise engineering, for which his phrase is engineering epistemology, right? Which is a term he borrows from philosophy, which is just literally interpreted in the title of the book, What Engineers Know and How They Know It. Knowing what and knowing that. Knowing that and knowing how. That's the way he puts it. Knowing that being the sort of maybe the scientific part, although there's other pieces there. Knowing how is, how do you build a lunar module, right? What's the science involved in the lunar module? It's more or less Newton's laws, right? Ideal gas laws and thermodynamics in the engines themselves, but the science of what they were trying to accomplish is not all that complicated in a lot of ways. Yeah, materials, properties, and things, but that didn't tell them how to build the thing once they got the assignment for it. All these other branches of knowledge they had to draw on, and types of engineering knowledge. So it's worth listing what some of those might be, either from the video or from just other experience. What sorts of knowledge do engineers draw on?
Experience.
Okay, good. Well, let's start. Science is one of them, for sure, right? Experience is one. What else? Okay. Experience. Common practice is a good one. They're obviously related. What else?
Experimentation.
Okay. Experiments.
Intuition.
Okay. I'm not too sure if you'd say intuition is a kind of knowledge, but it's certainly something that people draw on.
In some cases, reverse engineering.
Okay. Which is also a way of saying just what other people have done, right? So, in fact, that kind of draws on this. You know, there are people who have written about, like in the cases of the atomic bombs, how difficult it is to build an atomic bomb when you're not sure if it's possible. And the simple fact that you heard that the Americans exploded one makes it that much easier to do, because there's an existence proof, even if you don't have a single bit of information besides that. And people have actually gone and looked at how, when the Soviets heard that, how it affected their program. What else?
I would say maybe knowledge and policy
Okay, say more about that.
to help you kind of outline your design parameters and what you can and can't do. You need to be aware of what laws and policies exist that would govern.
Okay, so there's certainly legal and regulatory knowledge. I mean, in the aviation world, that's huge, right? There's all kinds of airplanes you just can't even build if you're trying to make an airplane to sell, because of regulatory issues. Very heavily structuring. Anyone here?
Current technology or capability.
Okay. That's again similar to the. Again, kind of pointing to the incremental, especially in companies. Very often you build on something you've done before. Almost always you build on something you've done before.
But I'd say it's equally important to look at bodies of knowledge that are only tangentially related. So I wouldn't say it's quite common practice, but common practice of industries that aren't your own.
Okay.
So borrowing, I guess.
Okay. I mean, it's not as true as it once was, but it's true virtually now. I mean, I was always an electronics designer, and any electronics designer, what was their office filled with? Data books. Anybody ever seen an electronics data book? They used to be very common. Now they're all online, but it's the same thing, right? There's just huge amounts of reference material, properties of materials, handbooks. You know, who knows the bulk modulus of certain kinds of steel offhand? You might know one or two if you work with them, but all this reference material that's built up. That's, a lot of it is experimental, right? Strength of materials is often very experimental. Some of it is science, but not always all that much of it. A lot of different kinds of knowledge that gets brought in. Now you type in any chip number into Google and you get the data sheet in a minute, but you still, you know, anybody who does any real work in I mean, the same is true in computing these days. You barely need a manual, but Google is your friend, and you can just draw. You're constantly working with a network, right? When you're doing design well, there's one other piece in here that in the little video that we haven't covered yet. They decide they want to make one window. So what do? They run the calculations and they make a drawing. And what does he say? Doesn't convince the boss, right? So what do? They build a model, which you could also think of as a demo. And he says, now I see it, right? Even though the model, the scientific data contained in that model is not any different from the drawing they made. But there's something about the power of being present and actually seeing it. That's literally what he says in that case. That communicates it to him. So these days, modeling, simulation, and again, used to be people would say, oh, simulation, that's not real engineering. You're not really doing that anymore. Now simulation is considered a legitimate form of knowledge. In fact, who here has written a paper or presented a conference paper based on a simulation of an idea? Right, like a good third of the class, okay? Even maybe 20 years ago, certainly 40 years ago, you would not have been allowed to do that. Simulation was not considered a legitimate form of knowledge in the same way. Others? There's a big one here that is the subject of one of the other readings that nobody's mentioned. Manufacturing. How you actually put the stuff together. You can also add to this organizations, management. I mean, arguably, not even arguably, it's provable. Grumman was chosen for this contract because of the things that they knew in their organization, right? Maybe they had a brilliant engineer or two here or there, but by and large, big projects like that get assigned because it says, you know how to build this kind of system, and we think that's relevant for that kind of system. That was true with North American with the main spacecraft contracts. And there's this thing that's kind of embedded in the organization that is a little bit ineffable and hard to see, but very significant. We talked a little bit about normal and radical design. What's interesting in Vincenti is he has a very hierarchical view of design. Like there's a big project design, big overall view, which you can certainly see that with Apollo, and if we have time today, I'll go through some slides on that. Then there's the lower levels, then the lower levels, then the lower levels, and there's somebody actually designing the piece of insulation that goes between the window and the thing. That is accurate in some way, but I'm not sure Vincenti really gives enough credit to how often those things interact with each other and how often the various pieces are either in opposition or it's not always so clean. And as a little bit later today and then into next week, we talk about systems engineering, very much the conflict between what's important that happens at the low levels on the factory floor, almost literally the guy in there pounding the nails into the spacecraft, or the rivets as the case may be, and the high level people with the charts and the pictures and the glossy 8x10s. And so a lot of issues there, and that's one of the things that we really kind of want to bring out today is how it's useful to divide that stuff up hierarchically as a way to think about it, but when you look at the practice, it's all often very mixed up. So we're thinking about Walter Vincenti, we're thinking as we go forward for the term, what kinds of knowledge are embedded in this artifact or in this decision or in this organization. And very often you can look at the conflicts that happen about different kinds of knowledge. Well, we proved on paper statistically that this system will never work, because if you add up the reliability or the unreliability of every component into a risk fault tree, you end up with an answer of 1, that it's going to fail. And then people on the other side saying, yeah, but the failures are not random. Statistical techniques only work when you have random failures. Every single failure has a reason. We're going to go find those reasons. We're going to eliminate them. And we don't think about it statistically. And huge debates will come across this when they talk about the computer that had a lot of influence on what sort of design decisions they made that were results of the conflict, but how to think about risk. Is it statistical, numerical knowledge? Has a lot of authority, looks really good on paper, convinces people who are very high levels of management, versus an understanding of reliability that's built into the system at a kind of design level. How do you prove reliability one way or the other? A critical piece of that. Another example, it was the 10th anniversary of the Columbia accident last week, and they ran on NPR a couple of the old Novas about the accident and then the investigation of the accident. And I happened to see Sheila Widnall, who was on the investigation committee the next day. And there was this case where they looked at the graphite leading edge of the wing, They looked at the size of the foam chunk that they thought had come off. Newton's law said, yes, that thing could exert enough force to break the leading edge of the wing. And that numerical analysis was actually persuasive to a lot of people on the committee. But they fought very hard, and they had to insist on an expensive test that actually put a piece of foam in a gun and fired it at a literal, they actually went to the Smithsonian and they borrowed the leading edge from the Enterprise that was on display there, and they fired the gun at it and blew a hole in the leading edge. And it was a very dramatic demo. They actually have film of the people who were on the accident board watching the demo, kind of having all of their either hopes or fears confirmed. They were happy because they found the cause. They were sad because of what it represented. But the demo didn't really add anything in a strict data sense to the analysis they'd already done on paper. But it was a very dramatic test, and it was the thing in the public's eye and in a lot of the eye of a lot of the other policymakers, many of whom were technical people, really persuaded them. So there's a case where, I didn't list it here, we mentioned it, but you know, again, a demonstration, you can call it an experiment too. That data has got a kind of value in the system greater in some ways than the analytical or the either sort of more abstract data. So let's turn to the Phil Scranton article, NASA and the aerospace industry, critical issues and research prospects. Anybody know who he is? I'm not sure if it was in the print of the article. Anybody want to guess? He's at Rutgers, that's true. He's a historian of industry, you know, really kind of down there on the factory floor. Has written a number of really famous books, mostly about 19th century manufacturing, and a lot of it is about the, you know, the history of manufacturing is always written sort of as a history of Henry Ford and General Motors and large-scale mass production. And he's always written about, gee, you know, 50% by dollar volume, if not more, of American industry, manufacturing industry through the 20th century is small machine shops, small local places, places with embedded knowledge. Even a Grumman, you think of it today as a big aerospace contractor, you know, it was a small aircraft company with a lot of hands-on experience building this stuff. And it was always a struggle to build airplanes in the mode that Henry Ford built automobiles to begin with. And it's not a coincidence, actually, and I love the quote at the beginning of the article where they say, you know, this wasn't rocket science, that's not quite it, but this was jewelry, right? The Apollo spacecraft were basically built like jewelry. They were built by artisan craftsmen, you know, with a lot of manual skills, a lot of one-off, even on each individual spacecraft, you know, even though they built 10 or 12 of them, they were all a little different. They all had different personalities. They all had slight changes in them. And there was very little uniformity and customization, and there certainly weren't large assembly lines cranking out, you know, with high levels of division of labor. Also focuses on this relationship. You mentioned the kind of stakeholders in Grumman. The stakeholder was NASA, okay? And there's a long history, very interesting history about generally the relationship of the federal government to industry. Who here has worked in industry on federally funded projects? Okay, a lot of people. If you go into the aerospace business in the long term, you probably almost definitely will at some point. Although it's true in other industries as well. And what is that relationship? Under the NACA, we'll read about them a little bit later in the month, there's a lot of in-house work going on in the government labs. By the time NACA becomes NASA, there's a lot more outsourcing going on. There's a lot of managing these contracts. Why is there tension around that set of issues? What's hard about, gee, why don't I just tell you what I want and you guys go build it? Seems pretty simple to me.
You have to give up a lot of control to do that.
Okay, you have to give up control to do it. Why?
Because if I'm building it, I can either micromanage myself or micromanage my direct employees, but if I have a different relationship with the contractor, it's probably not the case that I can sit and look over their shoulders the entire time. And a lot of the information that, if I'm managing a larger program, I need a lot of information from the people who are building the components in order to integrate the overall system. And I'm just not going to have that information in the way I would have had it before. So you're taking something that was a centralized, streamlined, relatively informal structure, and you're creating this set of hierarchies and parallel systems. And well, now you're the boss, but they have their own bosses.
Okay.
And you know, there's a lot more overhead. There's a lot more paperwork that's going to have to happen. Maybe they're in a different physical location. You can't just go down the hall.
Okay, good. All kinds of issues in what you said. Location, interfaces between organizations, interfaces between components of the spacecraft, specifications, uncertainty, a lot of this stuff. You know, this is a classic case in these things where the people who let the contract think they invented it, right? Oh, you know, we said we wanted a lunar module. We get the credit for speccing it out, and the contractors say, you know, the specs we got were not only were they inconsistent, they were inapplicable, and we had to do all this innovation to actually solve the problems. We invented it, right? And huge issues over credit and also blame. And he quotes, Scranton quotes Lee Atwood, whose book is really worth reading. I mean, a lot of these articles, by the way, look in the footnotes when you have the book review assignment, because they're full of great ideas for a book to follow up on, to read. And Lee Atwood's book, he was I don't know if he was president of North American. He was a top guy at North American, and had done the X-15 project, which was considered to be very successful. He had a record before that. I think even the P-51 was his project. Do you remember that?
Sure, he was the president of the division that did Apollo.
He was president of the division that does Apollo, and they're building this spacecraft. And where does the relationship between North American and NASA come to a boiling head? Over the fire, right? And you know, NASA's saying, oh, they didn't do their job. And the contractor's saying, we got so many conflicting requirements. We were expected to do things that were so far beyond the contract, under budget, so on and so forth, that who's really to blame here? And he has that really bitter saying. I think I printed it out. If things are done well, NASA succeeded. If things fail, it's the contractor's fault. And there's a lot of that feeling throughout Apollo, that whenever something went well, it was Gilruth and the Space Task Group and the astronauts who got all the credit. And then when things failed, it was always the contractors who were late, over budget, so on and so forth. And you can see how that would lead to some tension in the project. And when I interviewed a lot of these folks years later, there was still that tension in the project for them. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I mean, actually, I'll read this quote. It's actually from Scranton's article, but it's worth reading in a little more detail from Atwood. The command module got the attention of so many astronauts and so many other people. Talk about your stakeholders. They all had their ideas about how things should be arranged, how the controls should be set up, and an awful lot of brouhaha resulted. One of the astronauts says, you know, we have a pretty strong union, which is a very interesting thing for an astronaut to say, right? Because it makes the astronauts seem like laborers on a production line, and they were in a certain way. They were the sort of workers at the pointy end. They really did, he says. They really did. We had to face the problem of arranging changes, electrical changes which came from other parts of the stack and the ground equipment. There were just infinite refinements and changes. The impact on the command module was almost screw by screw and estimate by estimate and switch by switch. So, you know, one of the things you see in all these things, and this is a theme that'll come up through next week too, is the idea that system engineering is somehow taking the system, cutting it into a hierarchical pie, making the interfaces, and then everything is just done by putting those black boxes out for contract, bringing them back together, and putting them back together like that. There are a lot of people who see systems engineering that way, but it's, I think, a very naive view of how to really do systems engineering. And it's not how it was done in Apollo when it was successful. It was done sometimes when it wasn't. And you see that and they sort of dramatize it in that clip. He's constantly going back to NASA, and they're saying, oh, here are the requirements. Or the astronauts come in and they say, you know, I'm not going to do that. How can you do that? And the contractors wish they had a black box. They wish they could just deliver something that met the specs, except for the problem was that the specs weren't exhaustive. They didn't say enough. And, you know, we'll see later in the term, and if we have time later today, you know, there are points where NASA's literally sticking their noses right in the details of the code for the Apollo guidance computer and telling them which routines they should keep and which routines they should get rid of. That's not black box systems engineering. I call it white box systems engineering, which is every single component can be traced. Every single thing that is in the system can be known. You may not know it all at once at one time, but when there's a problem on a flight, you can very quickly drill down, find out, you know, where was that fuel tank tested, who signed off on it, how was it welded, so on and so forth. You know, Scranton talks about this idea that you know, the contractors are kind of constantly getting hit for delays, but delays in a program like this actually mean improvements because they're constantly doing things that they didn't know they had to do, and the very process of the engineering are the things that are not seen ahead of time, the unknown unknowns, which we've mentioned I think once already here. Yeah.
Just a factoid on that, which is that I read a study once for military acquisitions that 65% of all cost and schedule delays are not associated with waste, but are usually associated with the contractee, I guess, the whatever part of the military that wants the thing, changing the requirements 50 to 75% of the way through the design and production process.
Absolutely. We're dealing with that on a program right now, actually. But you know, some of that gets to, again, back to this idea of knowledge. Like, partly the knowledge that gets created is the knowledge between the organizations together. We're the government, we have a big idea, we have something we need. You know, we hire somebody to build it for us. They do the first round of building, and guess what? That helps us see what we need a little more, and we get more into it. And it's this kind of iterative back and forth, and the knowledge of what that thing is kind of lives out there somewhere in between the two organizations. You know, he lists these 4 themes, which are also worth keeping in mind, Scranton. One is initial design and building. That's more or less the part that we saw in the video, although we didn't even look at the building part, just the initial design. So in Scranton's theme, it's about 1 of 8. Test, redesign, rework. So a lot of that going on, often overlooked as we get into kind of Roger Launius and his thing about Apollo. Very rarely is that part of it written about. It doesn't appear at all in the Tom Hanks series From the Earth to the Moon. Another theme we just talked about, which is the NASA contractor relationship. And the issues that go on there. And then those relationships on the cutting edge. Meaning that when you look at programs like this, you know, they're almost all by definition doing things that haven't been done before, as opposed to, you know, if you were building an airliner, there would be a little bit less of this, although Boeing is certainly dealing with this issue right now, and a little bit more of this. And trying to streamline that is obviously valuable. He has this nice distinction between what's merely complex versus what's really a significant stretch. And you know, a lot of the checkout equipment, he says, you know, it's complicated, but it's stuff that people had done before, whereas what's really pushing the state of the art. And there's always this tension in talking about Apollo between, oh, it was this whole series of radical new inventions versus almost every piece of it was something that NASA felt they had pretty well in hand before they even let Kennedy make that decision. And some people say, well, there really wasn't any major leap of technology between 1961 and 1969. I suspect that people at Grumman would disagree with that statement. But the people at the high level say, yeah, we sort of knew you could do this and we sort of knew you could do that. So where are those leaps happening? Certainly we'll see later in the term, software is one of those leaps that nobody saw was even an issue when the program started, almost caused them to miss the end of the decade deadline. He goes through just a few things to highlight about Scranton. I mean, that's really an extremely good article. And if you didn't read it carefully, I suggest you go back and read it carefully. Mostly it's about Gemini and Mercury. But it may be the best article we read all semester, I think, as far as what he understands about how stuff actually get built and what the context of it are and what the different intellectual ways, frameworks are for looking at that. The whole business of, on the, I'm not sure it's in the article or if he said it to me personally because I know him pretty well, on the production line at McDonnell Douglas, they're constantly telling the workers, stop innovating. Just build the thing that's in the drawings. We don't want your innovations because every time they innovate, either it gets written down and then it's a very complex engineering change order, or it doesn't get written down and then there's a non-standard something in the spacecraft that could come and bite you later, or it's a piece of it that you don't understand. And again, that same kind of conflict happens between management or even engineers and the workers on the shop floor who actually have to build the thing, who will say, these crazy college boys gave me this drawing of this thing that's uncreatable, and in my machining or my sheet metal bending, I had to be the one who actually wrestled it into a form it could actually be created. And nobody ever talks to the people on the shop floor who do that by and large. There are very few sources on them. But if you did, or if you do go talk to them on another factory floor today, they'll tell you how much input they have into the system that is not really written down anywhere, that's not on the books. So that's where it was one of my questions on the quiz was, in Scranton's view, radical innovation creates not clear orderly hierarchy, but error, failure, and conflict. And that's one of the reasons you see it, if you know how to look for it, in so many places in these kind of cutting edge projects like this. And in his work on Mercury, he actually traces the engineering change orders where they had planned to have, we think we'll have 600 of them in the course of the project. We can probably manage that. And it turns out they're having 5,000 a month, I think, by the end of the project. And at least they're being written down. At least they're going through a process for the changes. But they're just completely swamped by the process for dealing with things that people realize just won't work when it comes to meet, when the metal actually gets bent versus what they had imagined was going to work. So I want to talk a little bit about Roger Launius then, another piece, parts of which we covered already actually, but it's worth just noting what he says about him, which is another big word that's worth using and keeping in mind, which is historiography. What is historiography?
Writing about historians.
Okay, writing about history. It's just the discussion of different ways to write history. And what Roger Launius has done, anybody know who Roger Launius is, by the way? Sorry?
He's a historian for the Smithsonian.
Right, so he was the chief historian for NASA for about 10 or 12 years. Now he's the head of the space division of the Smithsonian. So like when they give the Smithsonian a new old space shuttle, as they did last year, he's the guy who owns it. and he wrote this piece, which is a pretty nice sort of outline of 5 different ways to think about how people have approached the Apollo program. And a lot of the stuff he mentions, again, is either things we're going to read this term or things that are worth thinking about if you're interested for the book review assignment. So what are his 5 ways of writing about?
Not in order, but or at least one of them is the actual perspective from the astronauts.
Okay. The astronaut perspective. Which another friend of mine calls nose cone history. Why would he call it that? That's what the astronauts are, of course. What does he mean by that when he says that?
He's just kind of more focused solely on the experience of the astronauts and their story, not everything else that went.
Yeah, it's somewhat narrow given the participants. It's an important perspective from the people there, but they may not see a lot of the other pieces of the project. And even among those, I've got in my office every single one that's been written by. I think every Apollo astronaut wrote or co-wrote or ghost-wrote a book of one kind or another, or had a biography that was authorized by after they died. And some of them are really good, and some of them are not really good. So the mere presence there doesn't mean anything about the quality, but it's sort of the perspective of the astronauts. And it's generally been one that's been very popular. And generally, Launius also puts in the particular flight histories here. And he uses a phrase which is common among historians called master narrative. Anybody know what that phrase means?
One that people tend to know.
One that people tend to know. Yeah, good.
It's like a model narrative, and everybody tends to tell the story based on.
Yeah, it's sort of the official story, as it were. So the official story of, well, I'm trying to think of one from another period, but we can stick with Apollo with it and say, what is the story that's sort of the one that goes down in history as the one that everybody knows that. There's no, it's not like there's a law passed that this is the official. But if you go to a NASA center and if you, a lot of the interviews you hear, you'll hear what is the master narrative. The best expression of the master narrative of Apollo, I think, is Andy Shakin's book, A Man on the Moon, which is what the Tom Hanks series is based on. It's a perfectly good book. It is well researched, and there's probably nothing in it that's wrong. But it's a very well-controlled sort of version of what the story is. It doesn't have any of the gritty people in the factories messing around with the nozzles. It's got Neil Armstrong and Apollo 11 and Apollo 13 and all that sort of stuff nicely laid out.
I've heard the term stemwinder in other histories. Like
Yeah.
The stemwinder story is like the classic narrative. Like World War II is about, well, we were betrayed by the Japanese and
Yeah.
we lost the first part of the war, and then we came back strong and won it, through grit and freedom and whatever else.
Right, right. And so that's sort of typical. And people like me spend a lot of our time kind of undermining the master narrative in one form or another, or filling it in different places. Like, I don't know that the Apollo computer is even mentioned in the Andy Shakin book. And there's a lot of other ways you could tell these kind of stories. So Launius sort of identifies not necessarily only, but the astronaut perspective as closest to the master narrative. What are some of his other 5 ways of looking at it?
Foreign public policy.
Okay. Okay, which is also pretty much related to the master narrative approach. And what's the classic book there? John Logston's book, The Decision to Go to the Moon, which we'll read the sort of sequel to, which is Kennedy and the Space Race or whatever his. So that book was written in 1964 or so, and comes out of this kind of rational actor approach to political science that says, you know, if you want to understand the moon landing, you got to look inside why the president made this decision, how presidents make decisions, sort of classic way to write political history. And they take all this evidence and they're pushed by these kinds of forces and they make this kind of decision. You know, his book on Kennedy's decision is still probably the best book on the Kennedy decision. That doesn't mean there isn't more to say. John Tilko will do the lecture on that at the end of the month. And then there's other works that sort of encounter this. One of my students, as I mentioned, is, she's not on campus where I have her give a talk this term. Her dissertation is about the kind of diplomatic aspects of the Apollo missions after, because all the astronauts were sent on world tours, and they had these interesting experiences on those tours about presenting the project elsewhere. So her thesis and then her book will sort of fall into that category. And then he also talks about, there's also Walter McDougall's book, another really good book. I'm not sure if that's on the syllabus, if we did any McDougall this year. Yeah, we did 3 chapters on the Sputnik. And they both contain, and Launius is really good on that, there's both a liberal critique and a conservative critique of Apollo. What's the liberal critique? It's true of human spaceflight in general, too, right? What's the liberal critique of Apollo?
Why spend all this money when there's so many social problems to be solved?
Right. Why? I mean, particularly the 60s was a period of turmoil. There's always been a lot of poverty in this country. You can point to almost any problem and say, why are we not dealing with this problem and we're sending the people to the moon? And then the kind of extension of that is, why can't we solve urban poverty if we can solve sending people to the moon? And in fact, people like James Webb, after he left NASA, they tried to use systems engineering to solve exactly those problems, not with a lot of success. And then the conservative critique, which is more represented by McDougall, who's, he's retired now. He finished his career at Penn. When he wrote that book, he was at Chicago, which is known for what school of thought?
Basically, the Apollo program and programs like it are just a way for the government to control the development of society, technology, etc.
Right.
No, I mean, we've already talked about how the Apollo program was 5% of GDP at one point. That's just basically a giant government takeover of industry and science.
Exactly. So that's the critique, the conservative critique of who's McDougall's hero? It's not Kennedy. It's Eisenhower, who really didn't have a lot of time for human spaceflight. It wasn't his passion. Sputnik kind of came up and bit him from behind. He really didn't understand why people would find it important, and he was struggling to keep from getting into a space race with the Soviet Union, as opposed to Kennedy, who, you know, sees it not only as a way to control technology, but a way to you know, it's a strange thing to think about. Why would you think that you have this problem with the Soviet Union, right? It's a political problem, differing systems. Sometimes it's a military problem. Why would you think that developing technology is a way out of that problem? It's kind of a hopeful way to think in a certain way, but it's also a little bit strange kind of turn, like, well, let's invent more stuff and then we'll solve this problem. That's a crude characterization, but it's one way to think about it. And the conservative critique, which is very well led by McDougall, that book won the Pulitzer Prize, I think, or the National Book Award the year that it came out, he sort of represents that critique of Apollo. And again, Republican administration, Nixon comes in, the program was already kind of in trouble, but he effectively cancels the last couple of missions and severely constrains the ambitions of the, that characterization did not always play out exactly that way for the following 30 years. Roger Launius knows that. He didn't write much about it in that piece, and I think I may have mentioned the first day. What's curious about the politics of human spaceflight today is how much the Republicans say, well, you should really be giving these big projects to NASA. That's what George W. Bush did. And the Democrats come in and start privatizing it all and pushing it out to private industry. And the politics are a little bit screwy for what you're used to thinking about other kinds of issues. Okay, that's two. What's another of Launius's models?
The social or cultural implication.
Okay, good. He talks about Howard McCurdy, which is one of the best books on this. Again, a book that goes back in time, particularly that shows, what's interesting about spaceflight. Many things interesting about. One of them is that how much it was driven by imagination before it was driven by a lot of these things. You can go back to Jules Verne or earlier, but even in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, science fiction and science fiction writers and science fiction as an expression of what's possible was very inspiring to people. And we may go through the articles that Wernher von Braun wrote in Collier's in the 50s, which is, Collier's was sort of like Life magazine, or a very popular magazine, and illustrated by Chesley Bonestell, a very famous science fiction illustrator. And you can pretty much go through American space policy for the last 50 years, and they basically are following the blueprint that von Braun laid out in his Collier's articles. And people were very inspired by this kind of future. And that's a little bit strange, too. That's not the way we're used to thinking about how technology proceeds, right? You're used to saying, oh, engineers solve problems, there's a societal problem, people invent their way to a better life, This is much more, a bunch of wacky people got together. I mean, this happened in Weimar Germany before the Nazis got into it. Wernher von Braun, when he was very young, in his teenage years, was a member of one of these amateur rocket societies, and they were inspired by a whole bunch of different writing. And the Soviet Union is a whole other case and a whole parallel case. They had their own set of thinkers on that. Cultural imagination came before technological invention and very literally drove it. I mean, the whole, just the biography of von Braun, another good book to read for the book review that I'll think of the historian's name also at the Smithsonian wrote, goes through this. But so the social and cultural, not just implications, but the social and cultural origins of spaceflight. Human spaceflight is, it's not like, what is it not like? It's not like manufacturing, which is a technology that is very literally down to earth and something that, people are motivated to make more of something. It's very commercial. It's got all these complicating factors about, McDougall's book is called The Heavens and the Earth. Aviation has had that from the beginning too. These are sort of special, strange things that everybody kind of likes to believe in, and they really want to think that it's useful, and then it's the struggle to figure out how to make it useful, as opposed to, having a need to send people to the moon and then solving an economic need by. There's also, Launius lists a bunch of books under that section. I think the best one there is called Moon Dust, which was written by this English reporter who came through and interviewed a bunch of the astronauts. It starts out with a scene, I think it may have been Pete Conrad, and it still kind of dominates my memory of the book, is he goes to a science fiction convention in LA, and there are two autograph signing tables. One of them has a line around the entire auditorium and out the door. The other has one guy sitting there by himself. The guy sitting there by himself is Pete Conrad, who was the commander of Apollo 12, and the guy sitting there with the line out the door, do I know who that was? The guy who played Scotty on Star Trek, right? And he just used that kind of juxtaposition as like, have we really forgotten so much about the people who actually went to the moon? We've been so wrapped up in the imaginary part of the voyage, and kind of takes it from there. Okay, one more category that Launius lists.
Lunar science?
Okay, is a sort of history of science point of view. Not something we've said too much about so far in the term, partly because we're doing an engineering class, but we actually are going to have a really good term on lunar science this year because we have Farouk Elbaz and Dave Scott with Jim Head, who taught him lunar geology, and then Maria Zuber. So we'll get a really nice kind of cross-section of 40 years of lunar science. But there is this story, and there are a couple of very good books about, what are the origins of the moon? What's its composition? What are the dynamics of it as a planetary body? What does it tell you about larger dynamics of other planetary bodies? And there's been some good work on that. Comments on those four? Anything on the Linnaeus piece? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I thought it was interesting when you described astronaut perspectives as like mythical tales, because I guess that's like kind of what we've all grown up with, like you said, the master narrative.
Yep.
And I didn't really ever think about it as being a mythical tale. You just sort of was like, that's how it was.
Yeah.
Like that's what happened.
Right.
And it was sort of interesting looking at it, saying, okay, there's actually a lot more to this than just like this heroic tale that he also envisioned as what really happened, and that's how we from that.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. And one thing to start in response to that point is when historians or other humanists use the word myth, they almost never use it in the way that sometimes engineers use it, which is something that's false, right? They instead use the term myth as, again, the kind of master narrative idea that it's a story that a culture tells itself, independent of whether it's true or false. That embodies things about the culture that the culture wants to pass on to younger generations and retells about itself. Of course, the classic cases are the Iliad and the Odyssey, but you can talk about Gilgamesh, you can talk about the Bible. You can have a debate about whether the Bible is historically true or not. That is entirely separate from, it's clear that it plays a mythological role in Western culture as a set of stories that the culture tells itself, that tells things about what the culture wants to be about. And Apollo was designed that way, for one thing, right? It was intended to be that kind of story before it even happened. And then as the history gets written, it sort of settles into these kind of patterns. And again, you don't have to say anything about them being true or false. Like, as far as I know, there's nothing in Andy Shakin's book that is incorrect or false, but it captures that kind of culture of mythology. The Apollo 13 movie does that very well as well. Interestingly, the movies in the Tom Hanks series, some of them do and some of them don't, which is also kind of nice about that series. Actually, I think the best one in that series is directed by Sally Field and is about the astronauts' wives and what it was like to live with the astronauts and how they started getting divorced. Of the first 2 or even 3 groups of astronauts, every single marriage except for one ended in either death or divorce by the early 70s. So that's not part of the master narrative. That's a different way to tell the story, but a way to tell the story from people who are heavily involved. Really good point about mythologies and some technological stories get made into mythologies. You could think about Steve Jobs, and that's a process that's going to take 50 years, but eventually he'll be like Henry Ford or Thomas Edison and so on and so forth. But at the time he was doing the things that comprise the mythology, mostly he was trying to make computers or express himself or whatever it is he was trying to do. Whereas with Apollo, they started out and said, we're going to make a grand story about Western civilization that represents all the greatest things that we're capable of accomplishing. That's what's interesting about Apollo, right? It's, in fact, I think it was quoted in the Scranton article, was, the beauty of Apollo was that it was good for nothing and good for everything, which is a nice way to think about it, actually. Or I always like to say, basically a big piece of engineering performance art, right? It had no utilitarian value at all, save maybe a little science, okay? But a lot of value as a story, as a public presentation, as a part of the Cold War, as all these other things. Now, that's not to undermine it at all. Those other kinds of things are usually a lot more lasting and a lot more meaningful to people than, being able to, have a display that has twice as many pixels on it as the display you had on your computer last year. But it makes it interesting and complicated to think about it. And I said a little bit last week when we looked at that landing story, like it was an important part of the story that he turned the computer off and landed manually. Even though, as we'll see, it was really a pretty rich, complex fly-by-wire mode that he actually used to land. But a part of that story was you have the same thing that the astronauts were men, right? Anybody know when the first woman in space was? It was Tereshkova, and it was 64, I think. Is that the 63? Okay. First American woman in space?
Shuttle era.
Yeah. 81, 83, Sally Ride. Americans did not want women astronauts, and there's been good books that came out about this lately, which is kind of interesting because you think about it. What's the value in the chief engineering value in the lunar lander? We just talked about it. Weight, right? Women actually are a great way, on average, to pack the same human capability into smaller size and less weight, right? So for every little etching of that fuel line that they're doing, and for every pound of fuel they're shaving, they're spending, what's two guys, figure 20, 25 pounds difference each, 50 pounds there just to have it be a man, right? Instead of, a bigger window or greater landing payload or another scientific experiment, it mattered that much that it was men. And that's something that they've now, the good work has only come out in the last 10 years or so, gone through about how they actually sent 7 women through the same Mercury astronaut tests. Wasn't part of the program, but they did it in parallel. They did as well or better than the men did. They selected them, and at the last minute, it was actually Johnson, who was in the Senate at the time. Was it Johnson, am I right about that? Or said, no, it's not going to happen. They also looked at deep sea explorers and mountain climbers and other people too. But they said it's going to be military test pilots, which then de facto define them as men. So again, right at the core of the program, you have what does American culture want to think about itself? What does American culture want the world to think about it? And there's a whole list of characteristics. Being in control is one of them. Being male is another. Being white is another. That were important. And all those things have changed, right? So the astronaut corps is, just different people fly into space than used to, right? Just different people. Okay. So as you go through and in a way, the 3 readings for today are sort of the most abstract. They're not all that abstract either, but as far as giving us a little bit of a framework to think about what we're going to do and what you're going to read. So every time you read something now, pay attention to who the author's name is. That'll be useful if there's a quiz on it. And if you don't know who that person is, just do a little bit of digging. You don't need to do a whole lot, but is the person a journalist? Are they a historian? What kind of historian? What have they written before? Are they an astronaut? Are they an engineer? Anybody know the Murray and Cox book, what Murray is best known for? He wrote a book in the 90s called The Bell Curve, which was heavily criticized as a kind of racist view of the distribution of intelligence in the U.S. And was very much in the news. And he still writes a similar kind of demographics of intelligence kind of books. And this was his first book early on. People are always surprised to find it's the same Charles Murray. So pay attention to who they are. Think about, this is a pretty good category. There are other categories too. Did we miss one? Yeah, we did. We missed one. The hardware point of view. Which actually, I sort of disagree with this part of Roger on it because I think he talks about the fetish for the artifact, people who write just about the artifacts themselves, and he kind of groups, calls people who write about nuts and bolts and tell you about how that was done. Whereas I think it's very possible, as I try to do in my book, to write about the hardware and write about the engineering that's also embedded in all of these other things, and that you don't need to be focused only on the hardware. There are certainly books, and he mentions it, like Stages to Saturn, and there's this whole list of ponderous NASA commissioned histories on the history of the Saturn program, and they're 900 pages long, and they list every memo and every decision that was made. They're great reference books, and they're actually quite good, but they're not interesting reading in any meaningful way, and they're very kind of dry and matter of fact. But there's a valuable, I used them a tremendous amount when I was writing my book, and they don't talk about anything about the context or anything about what was going on outside in the rest of the world, but they do tell you week by week what was going on in the program. Also interesting to keep an eye out. And some of them are written, again, Scranton mentions the Hacker one on Gemini, which is the best of them. Hacker and Grimwood, I think. Okay. Comments, questions on all that kind of big overview?
How much are we going to talk about? It's maybe beyond scope. The overall Soviet program, but also like the social parts of it. Like one of the reasons those Soviets had female astronaut very early was in part because Soviet ideology said, all people are equal, and even though the Soviet Union had plenty of problems with racism and sexism, ideologically they made a very strong effort to paint themselves as a society that was very egalitarian, and that anybody could be anything. And one of the reasons why the civil rights movement happened in the 60s as opposed to in the 50s or the 40s is because that was the moment when the Soviets were challenging the United States more than any other. And a lot of times, civil rights leaders would point to, well, look at what the Soviet Union is doing. Maybe the United States needs to take a harder look at how we treat our society. But how much are we going to kind of talk about what the Soviets are doing?
We have one day devoted to it.
Okay.
We could do a lot more, because you're exactly right. And one of the interesting aspects of the race part of it is that, you have sort of the same Newtonian physics are in control, and these two cultures are approach these programs in some ways that are similar and a lot of ways that are quite different. And so you have this direct comparison. So actually, one of my colleagues, Slava Gorovich, he is writing a book, I think. He wrote a couple of papers on the automation of the Soviet spacecraft, which were very much along these different ideological lines, and also they had different skills and technology. So the comparison is very valuable for exactly the reasons you say. We won't spend too much more than that on. By all means, bring it up anytime. One of my good friends, Asif Siddiqui, the same guy who came up with this nose cone history, has written a lot about the cultural history of and he also wrote the giant sort of definitive history of the Apollo program, which we'll read parts of. He did that before he got his PhD, then he went and got his PhD. Other comments, questions? All right, let's call it a day there.